Lots of people in the U.S. have gotten tired of watching what the food system has done to our health.
In terms of corn, soy, wheat, and rice, we grow 15,000 calories per person per day in America. So that's like sixfold how many calories that we need.
Today, a scientist who spent decades studying nutrition and metabolism talks about good advice and not so good advice when it comes to what you eat.
It's very easy for people to kind of get on social media and often generate quite a following. And the more charismatic you are, and the more confidence you have in your story or your narrative about how you've figured out how the body works and what's been successful for you. And if you're a physician, maybe several of your patients have had success. I worry about that because that's not how science works.
Kevin Hall applauds the idea of making America healthy again. But the execution?
I think the signs are not looking positive, right? That we're counting wins as these very small things like getting voluntary removal of certain food dyes that weren't actually widely used in the food system in the first place, and talking about that as if it's going to have a major impact on the health of Americans, or promoting the use of beef tallow instead of so-called seed oils.
Coming up, surprising realities about food, weight, and where policy is taking us. Welcome to It Turns Out. I'm Kara Miller. Back in 2004, when reality TV was really catching on, Survivor was already a big hit, there was a show that oddly would end up telling us a lot about nutrition.
It was kind of a train wreck of a reality television show that was extremely successful. It ran on NBC here in the U.S. There were versions of it all around the world.
Tonight, it's the Biggest Loser Couples Edition, with 11 new couples weighing more than 3.5 tons.
Kevin Hall spent more than 20 years studying nutrition science at the National Institutes of Health, and he's a co-author of Food Intelligence, published by Avery Books. He also ended up studying many of the contestants on the show The Biggest Loser.
The basic premise was to take a bunch of people with obesity and essentially put them in this very extreme situation where they were cut off from their normal life. They lived on this ranch in Malibu, California, and engaged in these grueling workouts, and were instructed to kind of eat, a certain bare minimum amount of food, but they were, cutting calories in their diet by crazy amounts, and losing weight like at about a pound a day on average while they were on this ranch.
Hall says this pace of weight loss was tremendous. He had never seen anything like it.
It's faster than people who have bariatric surgery. It's faster than people who eventually get up to the very high doses of these GLP-1 class drugs. So a really extreme sort of intervention. And I just got really interested in the idea of what's going on inside these people's bodies as they're, engaging in this extraordinary amount of willpower to kind of change their life over, months on end on this program.
What Hall found out about these contestants was kind of surprising. And remember, these folks were living under conditions that if this were a scientific study, it would be very hard to get anybody to agree to. So the first surprise from The Biggest Loser was about exercise.
There's this common conception that if you just did enough exercise, and especially resistance exercise as part of your weight loss routine, then you would prevent the normal slowing of metabolism that's been known to occur for, many, many decades when people try to lose weight by cutting calories in their diet, for example. What happens is that the body's metabolic rate, the number of calories it uses to kind of maintain life, slows down. And so the question that we were interested in was, did that actually happen in these folks, or were the muscle and fitness magazines right that you could actually prevent this from happening? And so the first big surprise was that, yes, indeed, they had the slowing of metabolism.
The second surprise that came out of studying The Biggest Loser concerns whose metabolism slowed down the most.
Despite the way it was platformed on NBC, as in the people who worked out the most lost the most weight, in fact, there was no relationship between how much people were exercising and how much weight that they were losing. The biggest driver was how many calories they cut in their diet.
So surprise number one, exercise did not stop people's metabolisms from slowing. Surprise number two, the people who exercised the most didn't lose the most weight. And surprise number three,
the folks who lost the most weight, the ones who cut the most calories in the diet, those were also the ones who experienced the greatest slowing down of their metabolism. And so it wasn't that the metabolism was preventing them from losing the weight, because in fact, those were the most successful folks. It was that their slowing of metabolism was the response to how much calories they cut in their diet. So it was kind of acting not as the horse kind of driving the cart, following your weight loss, following your metabolism. It was the other way around. Your metabolism was following the amount of weight that you'd lost.
and there was one more thing. Maybe it will surprise you, maybe it won't, but it really stuck out to Kevin Hall. These contestants had just an enormous amount of willpower.
So this idea that, they had obesity to begin with because of weak willpower, well, that's just shot out of the water. These folks are exercising literally 3 hours a day, every day of the week for weeks and months on end. I don't have that kind of willpower. And so this idea that obesity was some sort of fundamental, weak will of the fact that they couldn't, eat a little bit less or exercise a little bit more, that's clearly garbage.
But you could argue that the most significant insights from The Biggest Loser didn't really surface until 6 years later, when Hall met up with some of the contestants and tried to figure out what had happened in the intervening years.
On average, they had regained about 2/3 of the lost weight, with a few people regaining all of the lost weight and more, and others having more or less success at maintaining some of the weight loss. But yeah, on average, they regained most of the lost weight. And yet, I guess one of the things that's really interesting is if I hadn't told you that they'd been on this competition, but rather had said, there's this group of people, they lost, 13% of their body weight. And maintained it at 6 years. You'd say that's a pretty darn successful intervention. It only looks like a failure because they'd lost so much weight, on average more than 120 pounds. That's the average weight loss at 7 months, and then regained a bunch of it.
So who regained weight and who kept it off? Hall had assumed that the people whose metabolism slowed the most would regain weight the easiest. Turned out, that was wrong.
In fact, it was the ones that maintained the most weight loss were the ones that were the most physically active. So physical activity tended to play a bigger role than calorie reduction in the diet over the long term for maintaining the weight loss. And really interestingly, those folks who were most successful at maintaining the weight loss were the most physically active, but they also continued to have the greatest slowing of metabolism.
We sometimes assume that people who are thin have fast metabolisms and people who are heavier are that way because they have slow metabolisms. Hall says, generally, that is a poor assumption. And all of this underscores something that's really important to keep in mind. Even though food and nutrition is frequently discussed, there's a lot we're still discovering. We need a lot more scientific research in this field. Not that that has stopped social media influencers from claiming to know what they're talking about.
Diet gurus have been around for centuries, as we kind of talk about in our book, but they haven't had the same sort of platforms that they have now, as you mentioned. And it's very easy for people to kind of get on social media and often generate quite a following. And the more charismatic you are, and the more confidence you have in your story or your narrative about how you've figured out how the body works and what's been successful for you, and if you're a physician, maybe several of your patients have had success. I worry about that because that's not how science works.
The good thing is that high-ranking government officials like Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have talked a lot about helping Americans get healthy. The question is whether they're going to help fund the science that's really needed to understand nutrition. And we'll get to that.
What scientists do is they say, okay, well, if the the body really works that way, then I should be able to design an experiment to either test that theory or falsify the theory, basically have some set of observations that wouldn't go along with it. And it's that latter part, which is, the really hard part. It's the really costly part, right? It's you've got to design the experiment, get the money to fund the experiment, run the experiment. And that's kind of what I'd been spending much of my time doing at the NIH for a couple of decades was, understanding these models, trying to understand what the logical consequences of those models were, and then designing experiments to test them critically.
Hall says, often the ideas that get thrown out, they do have a nugget of truth. They sound science-y. But people frequently recommend supplements, for example, that don't have a lot of studies around them. And even the manufacturing of those supplements and the question of what's actually in them, well, that's not very highly regulated either. One of the recent science-y sounding recommendations has been add more protein to your diet. In early 2026, Secretary Kennedy suggested we should be upping our protein. And if you've been to the grocery store recently, you've noticed protein's pretty much everywhere. It's now added to drinks, to bread, to waffles.
An expert in this space, Stu Phillips, that we quote in the book in this chapter on protein, he said, this past year was the year that protein jumped the shark because the hype around it has kind of far outstripped its usefulness.
Hall says there are some people, especially the elderly who may not get a lot of exercise, who may need more protein in their diets. But the average American, probably not. So when Secretary Kennedy argues that we should focus more on protein, Hall isn't convinced.
But I think the messaging was, no, we're not getting enough protein and we need to increase the amount of protein. It's like, no, some people, sure, maybe that's the case. But the vast majority of folks in the U.S. are probably consuming more than enough protein. And they should be focused on other things like reducing refined grains and sugar and increasing their fiber intake and vegetables and things like that.
And some of the touted benefits of high-protein diets are, in reality, kind of unclear. Many people believe that protein makes you feel more full. I've always heard that was true. But Hall says when you test this in the lab, people on high-protein diets consume hundreds of calories more. Now, you can design a study in which people on high-protein diets do lose weight, but it's unclear. Is it the protein that's making them lose weight, or is it the specific foods in that specific diet that's really doing it? We really need more studies to understand what is going on here. But when you look at the big picture and just the shocking rise in obesity over the last several decades, here's one thing we do know.
What and how much we're eating is less under our conscious control than we might like. Those biological drivers, those signals inside our body, as well as environmental cues and signals and how we're processing that information. We have quite a bit of control over, maybe an individual meal. But even within an individual meal, how quickly we're eating the meal, when we decide to put our fork down after the last bite, how big were the bites that we were taking. Those kinds of things are kind of flying under our radar, right? And over time, they sort of accumulate and our bodies are steering us in certain ways. And the types of foods in our environment and the way that we interact with those foods, I think is partly to blame for why we've seen this rise in obesity prevalence over decades and why it's so difficult for people to make those changes because it's not under our conscious control entirely.
In 1960, about 15% of Americans were obese. By 2017, 15% had become more than 40%. And during that time, the calories available to us that were ultra-processed just skyrocketed.
People who eat more ultra-processed foods of all kinds have increased risks for all sorts of things. Obesity, diabetes, several forms of cancer, cardiovascular disease, all cause mortality. That's been shown in thousands of these observational studies now. And the question is, why is that? What is it about ultra-processed foods that's doing it? And we can't rule out that it might be to do with the nutrients, right? So there's these diets also tend to be higher in sugar and saturated fat and sodium and all these other things that we've known about for a very long time. And so now there's this kind of two worldviews of looking at nutrition science. One is the ultra-processed worldview, which basically says let's ignore the effects of the nutrients, or at least let's not focus on them, and let's think about the extent and purpose of processing of foods and how that relates to the food system as a whole, and how these foods are marketed to us and their convenience level and all these sorts of things. And then you have the nutrient profiling perspective, which is saying, okay, well, at the end of the day, it has to be something about the nutrients that are driving some of these effects. And I see these two sorts of worldviews as not being necessarily pitted against each other, but are really just different lenses upon which to view both our food system as well as the effect of food on our health. And so some aspects really do have to do with processing, like when people are taking these very raw ingredients from the farm, like corn and soy and wheat, and running them through processing methodologies that make high fructose corn syrup, or basically deconstruct the protein aspects and dry them out, and are used as ingredients in ultra-processed food products. They destroy the food matrix that tends to kind of concentrate the calories in the foods, has lots of beneficial effects on shelf life, but it also ends up increasing the so-called calorie density. So for every bite of food that you take, because it's so dried out and it's been deconstructed in this way, you end up eating more calories, which is one of the mechanisms by which we think people who consume a lot of ultra-processed foods might be driving excess calorie intake.
So how do you then think about, like, if you go into the grocery store and you go find a loaf of whole wheat bread that's pretty shelf stable, that's going to be probably ultra processed. How do you think about the difference between that and buying a pack of Twinkies, which don't seem like the same thing?
Oh, they're clearly,
are they the same?
They're clearly not the same thing.
Okay.
They are clearly squarely, both of them, in this ultra processed food category.
Right.
What I think is also important to note is that there's nothing in the definition of ultra processed foods that says that they're harmful. That's an empirical question, right? And the empirical answer to that question is that if you consume a diet that's very high in ultra-processed foods, in other words, you're getting more than 50 or 60% of your calories from ultra-processed foods, and then you try to adjust for things like socioeconomic status and those kinds of education level and things like that, it seems like there really still is some effect of these diets high in ultra-processed foods. The question is on poor health. The question is why? What are the mechanisms? And so my view is that there's probably a subcategory of ultra-processed foods that are healthy. And there's probably, if we understood the mechanisms by which ultra-processed foods lead to poor health, we could re-engineer a bunch of things. Not the Twinkies and the Doritos necessarily to be health foods, but we could make the breads better, right? We could make the yogurts better. We could make we could maybe even make ultra-processed versions of pizzas that are good for you, right? Using some food technology and food science. It's by understanding the mechanisms by which the group as a whole is driving poor health consequences, and which subcategories of that ultra-processed food category are the primary culprits, that I think we can make a lot of progress. And we can still use ultra-processed products in ways that actually make it easier for us to consume more minimally processed products. The example I like to use is, I don't make marinara sauce from scratch every time I want to make a pasta primavera, right? And I use, dried pasta, and I use, which is not ultra processed for the most part, depending on which brands that you use. But the marinara sauce clearly is ultra processed because it contains certain things to keep the brightness of the tomatoes and preserve the. But I don't want to make that sauce all the time. But it makes making the actual meal, which is very then low in ultra processed foods, very easy. So it makes it convenient. So how do we leverage, relatively nutritionally good ultra-processed foods to make it easier for us as consumers to inexpensively and conveniently feed our families a more healthful diet. That's the way I like to think about how we can currently use ultra-processed foods and how I make my selections. I still look at them with a nutrient profiling lens. Is it low in sugar? Is it low in saturated fat? Low in sodium? I don't really care that if it's doesn't break those boundaries. I don't really care that much if it's got some colorants and things to kind of preserve the color of the food. That to me is not probably the main player.
I want to play you a clip from 60 Minutes from earlier this year. And it's an interview with Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he's talking about the food landscape, basically what we've been talking about, and sort of his diagnosis of the toll that it has taken. Let's take a listen.
70% of Americans are either obese or overweight. And it's not because they got indolent or because we became lazy, or because we suddenly developed giant appetites. It's because we're being given food that is low in nutrition and high in calories, and it's destroying our health.
So obviously, this is something that Secretary Kennedy campaigned on, and I wonder if that his view of what is going on, if that resonates with you, if that sounds like the right diagnosis to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty close, right? I mean, I think that's, I agree with the idea that the main driver behind our increasing epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes and the downstream cardiometabolic diseases that is befalling Americans in other places in the world is because of the changes and shifts in the food environment. And it's not just the foods themselves, right? So there is certain aspects of the foods themselves, but it's also how they're marketed to us, how cheap they are, how convenient the worst ones are, the change in our social structure around foods, the fact that, back in the 1950s and 1940s or 1960s, it would have been crazy to bring in donuts to your meetings, right? I mean, that would have been just like, what are you doing? We're not eating during work time, right? That's just not what we do. But gradually over time, the way that, food companies and the social constructs around food that we have, as well as the fact that they're basically ready to eat, the treats that would have taken grandma, all weekend to prepare are now available to you at a moment's notice at a fraction of the price, right? These changes in our food environment, I believe, are what's driving the increase in diet-related chronic diseases. Absolutely. But it's more than just the foods themselves. It's how they are incorporated into society.
So then the question obviously is, okay, so, what would you do to protect the public? And I'm going to play you one more clip from the same 60 Minutes interview, and you'll hear correspondent Bill Whitaker talking with Secretary Kennedy about, okay, then, like I said, what do you do?
When you're taking on ultra-processed foods, you're also taking on powerful industries, big ag, big food. What makes you believe you will prevail?
My belief that I will prevail is because we have the president behind us.
But the president has shown himself to be pretty much against regulations. So why would he support regulating ultra-processed foods?
Well, I'm not saying that we're going to regulate ultra-processed food. Our job is to make sure that everybody understands what they're getting, to have an informed public.
So I think one of the tricky things there is the Make America Healthy Again movement has really said, boy, our environment has really changed. This is really a bad thing. But then when you hear that response from Secretary Kennedy, it sounds like it's more of a personal choice thing. Like, if we just tell you what's in these foods, that will fix it. And I guess I wonder, will that fix it?
Yeah, I mean, no one's against consumer education, and no one's against kind of a better informed public. But I don't think it's enough, right? I mean, I think that we learned this even from the tobacco example, right? The more informed that people got about the health risks of tobacco products, it moved the needle a little bit. But every analysis subsequently that has looked at, what was the biggest contributor to the reduction and the public health success of reducing tobacco consumption in the U.S., it was taxation, right? It was a policy targeting these group of products and making them more expensive. It was an economic maneuver that was basically driving people's behavior. Not to say that it wasn't working hand in hand with these educational aspects, right? So I think that it's a mistake to just say that we can solve this with education and with providing people with enough information about what they should be eating. After all, we don't grow enough fruits and vegetables in America to meet the dietary guidelines for Americans. If everybody was to just become overnight say, oh, well, yeah, of course, I know what I should be eating. And we're all going to go out and start eating that way by magic. Well, oops, we don't make enough to kind of have you eat that way, right? So we need...
That's surprising to me because I thought we grow so much in America.
Well, we grow...
but I guess...
Well, we grow a lot of calories. And we grow, in terms of corn, soy, wheat, and rice, we grow 15,000 calories per person per day in America.
Wow.
So that's like sixfold.
That's a lot.
How many calories that we need. And after you account for exports and whatnot, it drops, I think, to something like 12,000 calories per person per day. So it's a huge amount that we grow, but very little of it. Those are the so-called commodity crops. Then we have what the USDA calls specialty crops. That's all the fruits and vegetables and whole grains and the things that are like the legumes and things that are kind of at the top of the list of at least the whole dietary guidelines for Americans. And so the idea that you can tackle this with information alone, and maybe if we had that magical epiphany and everybody started behaving that way, maybe there would be enough market forces to kind of drive change. And I suppose that might be true, but getting to that magical epiphany is unlikely, right? And so I think we need policy changes and we need regulations and we need some ability to intervene in the system. And we can't do exactly what tobacco did because unlike tobacco, where nobody needs tobacco products to live, we all need food, right? And I think that, to their credit, this administration has pushed for several, state waivers from the SNAP program to kind of eliminate soda purchases from SNAP. And so those are the kinds of policy things that I think could potentially start moving the needle. What I worry about is that they're mainly penalizations of ultra-processed foods, and there's not a lot of talk about what we replace them with, right? So how do we make healthful foods more widely available and convenient and tasty and cheaper for people? How do we kind of replace the things that we think are harmful with things that are actually going to promote health? And I've seen precious little of that. In fact, I've seen cuts to the very programs at the USDA and elsewhere that have talked about educating people with how to kind of the SNAP Ed program. How do you actually get people to use more of these kinds of foods that are helpful for you, how to cook them, how to prepare them? Cuts to programs that deliver from the farm to school programs, fresh fruits and vegetables. Massive cuts to those kinds of programs, and a little bit of movement on food dyes and these other things about kind of getting waivers for states to eliminate some ultra processed foods from SNAP, but it's been more than a year now, and that's about the extent of the success in this kind of space. And I think Bill Whitaker was right to say that this is a deregulatory administration. In fact, there's an executive order from the president saying for every one new regulation, we have to eliminate 10. And so our ability from a public health perspective to introduce new policies and regulations is very difficult. And in fact, I think we've seen some of the deregulations going on, not necessarily just in the food space, but in the environment space and pesticide use and BPA and things like that in our food system is we're deregulating in a way that's not going to make Americans healthy again.
You write about how more than 100 countries put taxes, for example, on things from sugary drinks to other sorts of highly processed, unhealthy foods. Could we make America healthy again without doing something like that, like setting up an incentive system? And I mean, to your point about cigarettes, you can buy them, but in many places they are expensive, and it's a disincentive to buy them, right?
Yeah, I mean, what we talk about in our book is that we need to kind of think about flipping our food system so that the tastiest, these products that are being heavily marketed to us are no longer kind of considered, daily consumption, but are sort of more recreational substances, right? And that the base of our diets and our food system has to be kind of what we all have thought about and agreed upon is a common sort of foundation of healthy living, which is lots of vegetables, lots of whole grains, lots of legumes. You can adapt that sort of fundamental basis to even like ketogenic diets or vegan diets, low fat, high fat, low carb, all sorts of different modulations around that. But the same kind of fundamental base is pretty well, there's a lot of consensus around it. People argue about these things on the margins, and what we often lose sight of is how much we actually agree when it comes to a healthful diet. But eating that healthful diet is difficult because, as we talked about, we don't grow enough of that food. It's not convenient. Yeah. It's not easy to prepare. We need some equipment to do it. It's more expensive. It takes more time, and people are just, they don't have that kind of level of investment, right? I mean, as much as I know about this, my diet is not ideal because, gosh, at the end of the day, ordering pizza, especially on a Friday, it's like, that sounds like a pretty good option for me because I don't want to cook anymore. I've been doing that all week for crying out loud. And I think, we're all human. And to some extent, if there was an incentive in place to make that pizza that I was ordering, out of a crust that had a low glycemic index. And in fact, one of the things that we talk about is in the book, there are people who've re-engineered pizzas to meet dietary guidelines. And they tend to be more expensive. But what if we subsidized those, right? What if we leveled the playing field and kind of not just talking about the taxes on the unhealthy options, but making the healthier options more affordable and convenient, and using what we can about food science and technology to actually invest in that and make it worthwhile for manufacturers and grocery stores to sell those products and market them to us. So that's that dual property. We need to kind of flip the script so that, I don't want to take away anyone's Twinkies. And I certainly don't want to reformulate to be a healthy Twinkie. I don't think that's even in the cards. What I want is to make your Twinkies the rare kind of exception and make it really cheap for you to have like a little package of nuts and seeds and, maybe dried fruit as your snack instead of the Twinkies in the middle of the day. Make that cheaper, right? Make that more readily available to you than and in every sort of corner store, as opposed to the Twinkies, which are currently in every corner store and much cheaper than the alternative.
But it sounds like even though this is an administration that kind of nominally has said, we really want to make America healthy again, reduce ultra-processed foods, it sounds like that would take a number of moves, subsidies, regulation, different things that so far we haven't seen.
Correct. Yeah, we haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
It's not too late, obviously, right? There's only the 1 year plus into this administration.
Right.
But I think the signs are not looking positive, right? That we're counting wins as these very small things like getting voluntary removal of certain food dyes that weren't actually widely used in the food system in the first place, and talking about that as if it's going to have a major impact on the health of Americans, or promoting the use of beef tallow instead of so-called seed oils in fried products, right? None of these products that we're kind of changing food dyes on or swapping out beef tallow for the seed oils are health French fries
Mm-hmm.
fried in beef tallow does not make them a health food, right? And
Right.
a candy bar that doesn't have the artificial food colors is still a candy bar at the end of the day,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And so
It can still be 90% sugar,
exactly,
which isn't so good, even if it's like,
or the
if you ate
cane,
just sugar,
the
they
cane,
would have no
that was
additives.
another win was like the cane sugar Mexican version of Coke, as opposed to the high
Right.
fructose corn syrup. Not a meaningful change from a public health perspective, right? So we should not be counting those as wins. We should be, really invested in the kinds of changes like you're talking about, the real world policies that will actually make foods that are healthy for us more convenient and accessible and inexpensive. And yeah, sure, we can penalize the other foods that we want to consume less of, like removing them from SNAP and taxing them and things like that. So those are, and then I would also argue investing in the kinds of scientific research that's going to get us to better understanding what things do we really need to focus on and change, right? We don't have any evidence that food dyes were at the top of the list when it comes to our diet-related chronic disease epidemic, but we do have a lot of information about, sugar and fat and salt and how they interact with each other, and in hyperpalatable foods and those kinds of things. And we need more research in that regard to kind of move the ball forward to figure out what are the best next steps.
Well, and to underline that, here is something, nutrition, that you've written a whole book about, many people have written about, many people talk about, people worry about all the time. And you talk about how we spend almost no money in our federal budget actually researching nutrition and understanding it. Like, it seems like the thing all the people, the Republicans, Democrats could agree, yeah, I'm very worried about my nutrition, my kids' nutrition, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and in fact, in the run up to the last election, we had people on both sides of the aisle, like Bernie Sanders and Cory Booker, were talking about ultra processed foods and better understanding what makes a healthful diet and what kinds of foods are probably driving poor health in America. At the same time, we had RFK Jr. talking about it, right? And so, I was kind of actually excited that finally, we actually have folks talking about this, and that there does seem to be very broad support, at the grassroots level and the MAHA movement. And so how do we actually make decisions in that environment, both from a policy perspective and an individual perspective? Well, we need better research to know what to do. And unfortunately, that has not come through yet either. There was an announcement, shortly after the new administration on a FDA NIH nutrition regulatory science program. That is, my latest information is it's so far been not funded. It's like it was a press release essentially, but there's been no financial backing for that. And so, of course, you can't do anything without funding. And so it's one thing to hold press conferences and talk about all the good that you're going to do, but it's another thing to actually fund the science to move it forward. And that's where I get worried about relying just on the narrative and relying just on the charismatic person telling us what we should be doing without then going out and saying, okay, well, how would we actually test this to see if it's going to work or not? How do we fund the science that's going to give us not the answer that we necessarily want, but the answer that we need? How do we actually go about that? And that's what I see precious little of going on right now.
Finally, I want to just ask you about GLP-1s, because to what degree do you think this discussion about obesity and deteriorating nutrition that we've been having for decades, that's like a non-operative discussion anymore, because there's an injection moving towards a pill that people can take, and it's going to solve our problems. Do you feel like that's wrong? Disabuse me of that notion, if I should be disabused of it. What do you think?
I mean, I think that I should caveat this by saying, I currently work for a pharmaceutical company that's in this space, but this is an opinion I've had long before that, and it's been documented in the past. And we talk a little bit about it in our book as well. I think that what we have is finally kind of a set of treatments for obesity and type 2 diabetes that are able to take the folks who are most susceptible to the shifts in our food environment and be able to treat them finally. Yes, there's side effects. They're very expensive currently, limited insurance coverage, things like that. But at least we finally have what appear to be safe and definitely effective treatments for many people. And I think that can be nothing but a good thing, as long as they continue to be safe and effective, right? And eventually the price is going to come down, and it's going to be more widely available to people. I can't say that could be a bad thing. However, we're not addressing yet, as we just discussed, some of the things that drove the increased obesity prevalence to begin with. And in some ways, what we talk about a little bit at the end of the book is, why did we get to this situation in the first place? And the way that I like to think about it is that we front-loaded a food system to maximize the production of calories. We have a calorie glut, and we had these wonderful food scientists and technologists who figured out these crops that we could produce, these commodity crops that we could produce at scale with high yields in industrial agriculture. We can use those cheap, high yield inputs as the way to kind of manufacture ultra processed foods that are basically widely available, and we avoid this question that's kind of haunted civilization since the dawn of agriculture. How are we going to feed enough people, right? And it turned out that we had this wonderful science and technology revolution that occurred, in the middle part of the 20th century that allowed us to maximize calorie production. The thing that we also document is that most of the increase in calories went in the trash. So about 2/3 of the increase in calories since the 1970s, for example, went in the trash. They did not go to generate increased obesity prevalence, but we still got the increased obesity prevalence. And what we now need to do is for the first time in human history, we know what the target population is that we need to feed. And the planet is going to roughly have about 10 billion people on it in the next several decades. And it's going to plateau, maybe even drop a little bit. That's what we should be targeting. How do we sustainably feed 10 billion people with a sustainable agricultural system that's not going to drive diet-related chronic disease, and it's not going to destroy our planet in the process? And in the meantime, that should be our focus, not necessarily on the obesity problem that we have right now, but how are we going to equitably feed the population of the world in 2050 and 2060? Mm-hmm. And in the bridge period, when we're figuring that out, we have this wonderful class of medications that's going to take the folks who've been most susceptible to this changes in our food system that we've had and be able to treat them and be able to kind of help them for the first time, and not have to rely on diet A versus diet B versus, supplement C as their kind of half-baked way to kind of manage them through this process. So that's I sort of look past our current obesity epidemic, past the cause of the obesity epidemic, and say, what do we need to do in the future to equitably feed the planet without destroying it?
Kevin Hall is a co-author of the book Food Intelligence, published by Avery Books. He spent more than 20 years as a nutrition and metabolism researcher. Kevin, thank you so much. This is super interesting.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more conversations like this. And if you want to hear about another health issue that is just totally reshaping our country, check out my conversation with Tim Fong, who's a co-director of UCLA's Gambling Studies program. It floored me how much gambling is reshuffling money, how much it's changing childhood. Check it out. Thanks so much to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support. Thanks to producer Matt Purdy, and I'll talk to you next time.